Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining. It's the portion of Vayeira. Another week has gone by. And we continue the annals and the stories of Avraham Avinu, Abraham, our forefather. So we're going to begin with a summary, as we always do. Quite a lot of events taking place. And we're going to then stop again at the various messages that we can derive, practical messages that we can apply to our own lives. So Hashem pays Avraham a visit. He's sitting at the entrance of his tent. He's actually recovering from an operation that was performed at the end of last week's reading, which was his Brit Milah, circumcision. And Hashem comes to visit him. Avraham suddenly notices while he's interacting with God that there are three travelers passing by. And he takes leave of God and he runs after these three wayfarers and invites them into his home. They were actually angels. They weren't really Arabs after all, but that's how Avraham and Sarah saw them. And Avraham and Sarah prepared a sumptuous feast for them. The angels then explain why, well, they haven't really revealed themselves as angels, but they explain why it is that they've come, what's their mission. And they inform Avraham that Sarah would give birth to a child exactly 1 year after that. 89-year-old Sarah laughed because this seemed impossible. She was already an older woman, long past menopause, and didn't think it was possible that she would have a child. This displeased Hashem. Hashem saw it as an element of lack of faith, notwithstanding the fact that it was quite a miraculous occurrence that was about to unfold. The angels then depart to destroy Sedom and the 5 surrounding cities, and also to rescue Lot and his family. Rashi actually tells us that an angel cannot perform more than one duty. Human beings sometimes can do more than one job at a time, but angels have very specific missions. One mission was to inform Abraham that he was going to have a child. One angel was coming to destroy Sedom, and one angel was coming to save Lot and his family from Sedom. So they each had very specific missions. Avraham then asks that Sedom be spared if it contains 50 righteous people. Remember, there were 5 cities. And the explanation of why 50, because then there would be 10 people in each of the cities that are kosher, that are righteous. So why would Hashem not want to save the entire city for the sake of it having a minyan, 10 people, righteous people in the city? So 5 cities, 50 people. But they couldn't find 10 in each city. I'm cutting a short story short. Avraham Avinu bargains a little bit. What about if there's 45 and down, up till 10? At 10, when they could not even find 10 in all of the cities combined, then it became a matter of saving Lot rather than saving the whole city. The angels arrive in Sedom, and Lot invites them into his home to eat and to rest. That was a good thing. The residents of Sedom are incensed. What are we talking about over here? We actually have people living in our midst who care for wayfarers and are interested in doing acts of kindness and chesed. It was absolutely in the bylaws of the Sedom constitution that you were not allowed to entertain guests. No guest would be allowed in. But Lot protects his guest. The angels then strike them with blindness, and they tell Lot, take your family and run for your life. Hashem rains fire and sulfur on Sedom and the whole region, which is now known as the Dead Sea region, lowest region in the world by hundreds of meters, and also the salty region where nothing grows. So it seemed that until then, that was a very fertile region, and there was this massive unfolding of fire and brimstone that destroyed the entire region. Lot's wife defies the instruction not to look back. She does look back, and she was transformed into a pillar of salt. If you go into the area around the Dead Sea with any tourist guide, so I've seen them. They've pointed to a particular pillar of salt because there are lots of them in that area. Just the formation of the sulfur rises. They actually have these lots of pillars of salt, and they point to one and they say, that one is Lot's wife, and then they all take pictures and they're very satisfied that they know exactly which one is Lot's wife. We don't know which one was Lot's wife, but we know that she turned into a pillar of salt, as the Torah tells us that. Lot and his daughters then took shelter in a cave. They believed the entire world was destroyed. This was just them. When you see so much destruction around you, you start to imagine this is the world order, everything. There's been a nuclear eradication of society, and we are all that's left. Lot's daughters intoxicate their father, seduce him to repopulate the world. They each give birth to a son. So this is literally from their own father. These two children are the antecedents of Ammon and Moab. Two nations are born, one from the one daughter and one from the other daughter. Full stop. Then comes Abimelech, the king of Plishtim, and he does something similar to what Pharaoh in Egypt tried to do previously. This is the second difficult event of Sarah being abducted, with the king, either previously Paro, now Abimelech, wanting to take Sarah as his own. And both times Avraham had asked that she mention that she is a sister rather than a wife, because if he was a wife, they would kill him immediately. Sister, they would let him live, because the husband has to be killed so that there's no feeling of guilt. But if there's not a husband, then he would feel entitled, which he did. Hashem then afflicts Abimelech and his palace. They get all kinds of disease, and he warns them to return Sarah to the husband. Abimelech showers Avraham and Sarah with gifts, and he and his household were healed. Okay, between the lines over there, Abimelech actually turns to Avraham and says, how could you do this to me? Why did you tell me that you were a brother when you weren't really the husband, and you nearly caused me so much pain, and I'm righteous, such a righteous guy that he wants to grab some woman against her will. He doesn't see any problem in his own behavior, but he does point fingers. Now, at the age of 90, this was a year later, remember she was 89 when they got the message from the angels that she would have a child. A year later exactly, Sarah gives birth to Yitzchok. Avraham circumcised him at 8 days old. So that's now the birth of the next generation of Am Yisrael, our people Israel. Sarah notices that Yishmael was a negative influence on Yitzchok. Hashem tells Avraham to listen to Sarah and to expel Yishmael and Hagar. This is the reading that we read on Rosh Hashanah, first day and second day of Rosh Hashanah. Hagar and Yishmael run out of water in the desert. An angel shows her a well of water. Yishmael then grew up in the desert and became a skilled archer. Avraham Avinu enters into a treaty with Abimelech and reprimands him for stealing his wells. So there's a lot of detail here, like personal people issues, which are less than, I was just discussing it with Fegi before, less than you would imagine. These are the leaders of Am Yisrael. So we imagine, let's just talk about the things that are supposedly so weighty and so important. And here we're talking about the capture of Sarah, the wells, and attempted stealing of the wells, because Hashem paints the life that Avraham and Sarah had to endure. It was not a miraculous life all the time. They dealt with issues. They dealt with trials, tribulations, people, lots of things. And all of this is meant to instruct us and teach us how we have to negotiate the challenges of our own lives. So let's go through some of the messages that we can derive from the storyline of this birth of Yitzchok and the whole story behind it. Now, we are told in the Talmud that he said, "My Lord, if I now have found favor in your eyes, pass not away, I beg you, from your servant." Who's this? This is Avraham talking to the angels. Said Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Rav, this is to teach us that taking in guests is greater than receiving the divine presence. Now, this is a huge statement. But we're interpreting this verse, "My Lord," is that actually, before the angels arrive, because this is when they're about to come, he turns to Hashem, who's talking to him. God approaches Avraham in his tent. Hashem is talking to Avraham. Avraham then says, "God, please, if I can find favor in your eyes, please don't go away. I beg you from your servant." And then he runs out to go and greet the 3 wayfarers, these 3 Arabs in the desert. So he actually is talking to God. He puts God on hold. He says, "Hashem, please wait. I've got something very important to do." and I'll come back. The Talmud stops and says, just look at the priorities that Avraham is ordering his life with. He's talking to God. What could be more important than that? What event in his life could supersede his talking directly with Hashem? God appears to him directly. And yet Avraham says to Hashem, please wait for me. I have to go and bring these guests into my home. Says the Talmud, a message for all of us, that it is to teach us that taking in guests, bringing in guests into our home, and doing acts of kindness to another human being is greater than receiving the divine presence. I mean, this is a phenomenal statement. Talking to God is of less importance, talking directly to God, miraculously as Abraham did, is of less importance than welcoming a guest into your home. And Hashem sees it such. It's not that Hashem was put out. Hashem was happy that Avraham would be dealing with another one of God's children rather than talking to Hashem. This is a huge statement about the greatest possible spiritual endeavors are overshadowed by the act of kindness that we do to another human being. That is remarkable, setting the stage of who Avraham was and how he lived for chesed. And that's going to unfold in the way that he receives his guests, kindness and care. So says the Talmud in Sota, the way of Hashem is to do tzedakah and justice. So the Talmud says, follow the attributes of Hashem. You do what God does. God has looked after the world, looks after people, makes sure that we have our basic needs. So we should follow the attributes of Hashem. Clothe the naked, visit the sick, comfort mourners, bury the dead. Just as Hashem looks after, we should look after. We should imitate the attributes of Hashem. We're talking before when we were sitting at dinner, that what does it mean that Hashem created us in his image? In what way is a human being in the image of God? Certainly God doesn't look like a human being. How are we created in the image of God? Hashem gave us the capacity to imitate the attributes and the strengths that God put into this world. Only we, the only creature that has the choice to be able to initiate, to be creative, to be able to do chesed and kindness and imitate God's positive attributes is the human being. That's how we are in the image of Hashem. And here we are told that tzedakah, kindness, justice, caring for the next human being is an act of imitating what God is. And I've mentioned this before, but it's interesting that the introduction to the Mishnah from Maimonides, from Rambam, he says over there that he draws a distinction. When it comes to matters of mitzvahs that are between man and God, there a person should never say, I could never ever do this. It disgusts me. The act itself disgusts me. For example, I could never eat chaza. How could I eat pig? It's such a despicable act, I could never do it. Says the Gemara, no, don't say that. You should say, I could eat pig, but God told me not to. And so it should be for all the commandments that God told us not to do. We shouldn't say, I'm so repulsed by this act of godliness that would define godliness. I'm so repulsed by it, I could never do it. I could never do such a thing. The Gemara says, rather say, I could do it, but God told me not to, so I won't. But that, says the Rambam in his introduction to the Mishnah, only applies to those categories of mitzvahs that are between us and God. When it comes to categories of mitzvahs between us and another human being, we don't do that. We don't say, I wish I could steal. I would like to steal. But what should I do? God told me not to steal. I'd love to murder, but God told me not to. There the Rambam says, no, don't ever say that. Acquire the characteristic of kindness. A person should say, I'm so repulsed by the possibility of harming and hurting another human being, I could never do it. Not only because God told me not to do it, but my very nature denies me the possibility of doing it. So the Rambam draws a distinction. When it comes to matters between ourselves and God, then God says, don't eat non-kosher food. There we could say I could quite easily eat it. Who knows? Maybe I would actually enjoy a piece of chaza, but God told me not to. So that's the discipline. I will hold myself back. But when it comes to humanitarian acts, there we should not say, my natural nature is to do the act that is coarse, evil, harmful. But God stopped me, so what should I do? I'm not going to kill. No, there we should imitate God. We should acquire the attribute of kindness. And Avraham embodies kindness. He embodies the very nature of caring for another human being. Here you got 3 Arabs in the desert. He's talking to God, puts God on hold, and runs to look after another human being. Avraham is teaching by his very lifestyle how one has to be kind and caring of another human being. We're going to come back to that theme of kindness because soon we're going to see the pole opposite and the contrast, and that's how we said in the title of the shir, we're talking about kindness and intolerance. Because very often, and we've discussed this before, whenever the Torah teaches us important matters, it often, for emphasis, contrasts the very opposite of the one for the other, so that we can see them in a stark contrast. We can see the realities side by side. So we'll come back to kindness when we'll soon see a society that is built on the opposite of kindness, intolerance. But meantime, it's an interesting way that God says, I know Abraham and I love Abraham. I cherish him. Why? Because he will instruct his children and his household after him to keep Hashem's ways. So it's very, very enlightening verse. Why did God see something special in Abraham? Well, we could say he passed 10 tests. Ultimately, he was ready to sacrifice his own son for the sake of God. We know that Avraham was so dedicated to Hashem that he was ready to give up everything, to go on a Lech Lecha, journey from his hometown, as we learned last week, all the way to Egypt when there was famine back. There were a lot of reasons why God could love Abraham. But it tells us the real reason. The real reason is that Abraham was a true child and servant of Hashem in the fact that he passed it on to the next generation. That was the most powerful manifestation of God, of Abraham's accomplishments and achievements. Not so much his own personal tests that he passed, as great as they were. But why did Hashem cherish him? Because he instructs his children. When we're able to give over our message, because we live it, because we love it, because it's so important to us, when we're able to convey values to children, that tells us how important the values are to us. Because not only do we live by them, but we live by them in such a way that it impacts on the next generation. And that's why Hashem loved Avraham the way he did. Our ability to be mechanech, to educate the next generation, is the best window into our priorities in this world. Even more so than our self-sacrifice, and more so than the amount of hours we're spending doing things that are important. The acid test is, are we able to pass it on to the next generation? Have we lived it to such a positive degree that our children embrace the values that are important to us? Interesting point about passing on important. Now, we come to the city of Sedom, and the cry of the victims of Sedom and Gomorrah is great. And because their sin is very grievous. This is where Hashem is telling Abraham, I'm going to destroy. I'm going to wipe out these 5 cities. Sedom, terrible environment, terrible place. There's terrible cries and shouts emanating from such an evil society. I'm going to destroy them. So the Midrashim always fill in what was going on in the city of Sedom. So the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer says in Sedom it was decreed. This is built into law. Whoever hands a piece of bread to a pauper or stranger shall be burned at the stake. So you could have an environment where people are not so compassionate, where people are not empathetic. You could have a society that people miss their opportunity of being kind. What happens if you get to the point that a society actually founds itself on such principles? Not only are people weak in fulfilling what we would expect of them, an act of kindness. No, society prohibits it. It becomes built into the very bylaws of that society that you may not do an act of kindness. If you do an act of kindness, you're going to attract more, and then more people are going to be dependent on us, and then we're losing our own wealth. We build into our law system not to be kind. So why would this be discussed in the same portion as the introduction to Avraham? Because look at the stark contrast between two societies. The household of Avraham, which is built on kindness, which has a tent open on all four sides so that wayfarers can be seen on any side that they might be passing by. He'd be able to see them and grab them, bring them in. That the home was open to everyone and to all. That is how we are introduced to the journey of Avraham. And immediately after that, by stark contrast, in the same portion, we are told, look at the polar opposite. A society that says that it is illegal to act kind. And the Talmud gives us this very graphic example, so we can actually visualize how evil this society was. And it says that they had beds upon which the travelers were put to sleep. If the guest was too short, start the other way around, if they were too long, they shortened him, says the Talmud. It leaves us to the imagination how they shortened him. If a guy's longer than the bed, you cut him down to size. If he was too short, they stretched him on a rack so that he fitted the bed exactly. So they had a torture rack. And any visitor, hapless visitor that happened to come into the town would be tortured by either having himself amputated to size or stretched to the size of the bed. And obviously the Talmud means something beyond just a bed. But what image do you have when you read this metaphor? They had a one-size assessment, and everyone had to fit into that size. There was no possibility of an alternative. This is the absolute pinnacle point of intolerance. There's only my way, and if you don't fit into my way, I will manipulate you into my way. There is no room for any other possibility but my way. So this bed that is mentioned in the tractate and the Talmud of Sanhedrin certainly represents, beyond the horrific image that we have of poor, hapless people falling into this town and being having limbs amputated and being stretched as people did on a torture rack. But this is something that we can think about in our own society, because in a subtle way, we can look at other human beings and say, you have to fit into my structure. This is the way I see the world. I fit into the way I see the world. And if you don't, I'll cut you down to size. When a teacher looks at a student and sees that student having to fit into exactly how I believe you need to be, because everyone has to be the same. And this is how I measure it. And there's no room to realize that this person has this talent, and this person has that talent, and this person has this interest and that interest. And you've got to deal with a human being. Don't pigeonhole this person into your predetermined little pocket and then destroy them. And God forbid, parents can do this to children, where we take all the different kids in a family and everyone has to be the same, because this is the way I see it. And there's no room to say, this, my child, has this talent and ability, a desire to move in this direction, and this child in a different direction. How do I help each child reach their full potential? It's not about fulfilling my understanding. It's about fulfilling their growth patterns and need. And that's how school, and that's how educators and parents and teachers, that's how we have to look at these young budding children. How do I realize their potential, their individual possibilities, rather than cramping them into what I believe is the only way? That's what this bed of Sedom represents. And it's just so interesting that we have both of these insights into the evil society of Sedom, where legal laws were put into their code so that they would never, ever, God forbid, do an act of kindness to another human being. That was absolutely illegal, burnt at the stake. Or they would pigeonhole everyone else into their own predetermined understandings. There was no room to understand people for who they are. No empathy, no tolerance, no ability to understand. The very opposite of the nature that Avraham so embodied in the way he conducted his life. And we see how Hashem responds to God. When God says, I'm going to destroy the cities of Sedom, what is, again, the response of Avraham? Back to the theme of kindness, back to the contrast. He confronts God. He's brave. He takes on God and he says, would you destroy the righteous with the wicked? We actually quote some of these wordings in our liturgy over Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. The Zohar faults Noach for not praying for his generation. Noach saved his family in the ark, his family. But the rest of the world, Noach, says the Zohar, did not have enough time, effort, and commitment to look after the world around him. And ultimately, he ensured that his own family, his loved ones survived, not more than that. Look what Avraham does. It's the wicked people. Avraham knew exactly what societies these were. And he turns to God and he says, wait, Hashem, please. And he begins to plead, maybe there's a worthy person, maybe. I'm going to look, maybe we can find somebody who we can encourage to be righteous. Didn't exist. But that was Abraham's headspace. It's not about me surviving, and it's not about me looking after my own private interests. It's about me looking after the world. Everyone was somehow part of Abraham's pathway forward, wanting to look after everyone, all and sundry. Again, the very opposite of the society of Sedom, who said that it was illegal to care for another human being. Now, this is a very, very magnificent message to all of us. Immediately after the destruction of the cities of Sedom, so Avraham had failed. He had turned to God and he'd say, please save the cities of Sedom, because maybe there's a righteous person, maybe there's this, maybe there's 45, maybe there's 30, 20, 10. And then there wasn't. So Avraham goes home dejected. He was unable, notwithstanding all of his prayers, to save the cities of Sedom. So in his own mind, he could see his last activities as a total failure. He wanted to impress God to be kind and gentle and not to harm anyone in Sedom. Didn't work. Then it says, and Avraham went to the place where he had stood before God. So he goes back to the same place that he was praying when he prayed for Sedom. He goes back to that self-same place, stands there, and the Talmud says that standing has an implication of standing in prayer, and he begins to pray again to God. And from here, we learn a practical law that applies to all of us when we go to Shul, and that is we should have a set place in prayer. It's called the Makom Kavua, a set place. So if we have a place in Shul, we should try and daven in the same place every time, not different places every time. Obviously, it's not worth a fight. I've seen fights break out where in the old Walman Street Shul, which had about 1,500 seats, and I took my brother-in-law with me once who was visiting from Canada, and he sat down in a seat. There was about 1,499 seats that were empty, almost at the time. And as he sat down, somebody came over to him and said, no, you can't sit there. The visitor seat is over there, and directed him to move seats to another pew because that's where the visitors had to sit. So he burst out laughing. He thought they were kidding. He thought it was a joke. It wasn't such a joke. I've seen fights break out where a guy goes over to somebody and says, you're sitting in my seat, even though there's plenty of seats around it. So this is not worth a fight. But if there's no fight, it's if all other things are equal and it's easy, so daven in the same place. Where do we learn it from? This verse. Avraham goes and he looks to find the same place that he'd previously stood in prayer, and he wants to daven in the same place. And what message do we derive from that? When we fail, we often reach for the easiest explanation for our failure. And the easiest explanation for our failure is generally everything around us. Why did I fail? Because the conditions weren't optimum. Why did I fail? Because the people around me weren't doing the right thing. And we attribute all of the other areas in which we are less than perfect to the environment, to the things, to the people, to circumstances, situation. It's all situational. And therefore, what is the obvious method to improve our lot is to move on. Because if everything about my life that is not going right has everything to do with things around me, I've got to move to a new place. I move to a new place, and there I'm going to succeed. Most often, because we're not really confronting the realities of our lives, we carry our troubles with us. And very soon, in the new environment that was so perfect and so good and so beautiful, we eventually start failing there too. And we don't learn from it. Our new understanding of why things are going wrong is because we have to move again. So our life is about situational issues, and our solutions to life is situational. Just move to a new place. If things are not going well, so easy with our kids at school, what's the answer? Move schools, change classes, move on. You had a bit of a faribul in the shul. Somebody looked at us with a krumen nose, with a skew nose. So we get upset. We move on. Got another shul. That's the shul I'm not going back to ever. And we do that with relationships. We think they are disposable plates that they get dirty, you throw them out. So if there's a problem in marriage, you move on. Chas v'shalom. It's the easiest thing. You just divorce and find another partner in life. And that's how we discard important things in our lives, because we have this thought process that everything that is wrong has to do with things around me. And we don't want to confront the real place in which we can affect the greatest change, and that is in ourselves. Like we said right at the beginning, Lech Lecha, Avraham Avinu had a journey. The journey was into himself. When we recognize that the reason that we failed might have something to do with me reaching deeper into myself and finding strengths that I have not realized until now, that's when we start finding solutions in life. And all of this lies within the words of the Talmud. Look at Avraham. He davened, he prayed to God, he failed. What does he do the next time? He goes back, and the Torah tells us, to the same place, the exact same place. Because he says to himself, if I failed in my prayers, it wasn't the vantage point. It wasn't because I was standing on the wrong side of the road or next to this or the other. I'm going back to the same place because what really has to change is me. What really has to grow and develop is me. I am the author of the success that's going to emerge because I'm going to dig deeper into myself. And that's a phenomenal message, because the contrast, the polar opposite of Avraham in Ethics of Our Fathers is Bilam. And in the book of Numbers, we have the whole story where Balak attempts to curse the Jewish people through Bilam, and Bilam fails. And there the Torah tells us, on each occasion that he fails, he says to King Balak, let's go to another place. Let's go to another vantage point. Let's stand from another viewpoint, and then maybe I'll be able to curse the Jewish people. His philosophy in life is that if things went wrong, it obviously has to do with the place, space, and everything around me. And if I change what's around me, that's how I'm going to succeed. The very pole opposite of Avraham, who's often contrasted with Bilam in Ethics of Our Fathers. Avraham says, I'm going back to the same place. And that's a deeper element of standing in the same place in the shul each day. Is saying, this whole process of reaching God has to be not about trying to find a better vantage point. If I stand a step closer, from this point, I'll be able to get closer to God. Let me go to the same place. And in the same place, I'm going to make a difference. Because the difference is going to be in me. And that's the catalyst. That's the ingredient that's going to be the ability that I succeed. So taking ownership and responsibility gives us an empowerment. It empowers us Because if it's everything around us, we're always on the run. If it's something within me, and then I'm a victim. If it's something within me and I'm taking ownership, then I'm actually empowered to do what I need to do to turn it around. What a beautiful general story in life. And Avraham named his son Yitzchok. And it's interesting is the word Yitzchok means laughter. And the word Yitzchak, laughter, is something that actually happens on a number of occasions in this week's portion. You don't often have laughter, but this week we have laughter again and again. We have the laughter of Sarah, which we said already in the summary, was seen by God as an act of less than total belief in God. She laughed because she could not believe even the possibility of an old woman giving birth to a child, and we could understand her. It did seem impossible. It was a beyond miracle event that was about to unfold. She laughed because she was in disbelief. Then there's the laughter when Yitzchak is born. That's the laughter of joy. And then there's also laughter as Lot is leaving Sedom with his daughters, and there were sons-in-law who were told, pack up, let's get out of here. And it was a big joke in the eyes of his sons-in-law. They also laughed. Their laughter was scorn. Their laughter was ridicule. Their laughter was saying, you're crazy. Why are you leaving Sedom? This is the best place in the world. This is where we love to live. We're never leaving. You've got this idea of a God that's telling you what to do. They were laughing. So it's interesting that the same word, Yitzchak, to laugh, can come into different modes. And sometimes it's very important to know ourselves. What's the nature of my laughter? Is it disbelief? Am I laughing with, or am I laughing at? Do I know why I'm laughing? Very important, because sometimes the very same act of laughter could be poles apart. There could be opposite ends of the spectrum. There could be laughter of joy in God, and it could be a laughter of absolute derision and mocking. That's how it could be. And the way it looks, two people are laughing. The one is making fun of, and the one's having joy in somebody else's success. They're both laughing, but it's two worlds apart. And I've told often about Reb Mendel, one of my guides and guiding lights in my yeshiva years, Reb Mendel Futterfass. He often said that the difference between atzvus and merirus, and the right words would be a person who is very seriously contemplating the weaknesses of a person's life, and therefore feeling down because they are aware of so many areas that needs to be fixed in their life. A serious introspection, which results in the person feeling down. He said is just a hair's breadth away from somebody else who happens to be in deep depression, who is in a frame of mind that is indifferent and that is depressed. And you look at these two people, their faces look the same. They're both looking down, but they're worlds apart. And how do you know? How do you know that this person who is in serious introspection and coming to a point where they feel so bitter in their hearts, so pained by the failures of their past? How do you know that person's not depressed? How do you know the person who's depressed is not seriously contemplating their areas that need to be improved? And he used to say, sometimes you can't tell at the time. You look at their face, they look the same. Two people look the same. You know when you're going to know? Is tomorrow morning. Because what's kum tarois from them? What emerges from that mood? The person who's in depression is not going to get out of bed tomorrow morning. Why should he get out of bed? He's feeling depressed and down and indifferent and apathetic and nothing matters. He's just down. So he's not going to get out of bed tomorrow morning. But the person who spent an hour by Shema thinking about, well, how did my day go? And how could I have failed in this area? And why was I weak in this? And why didn't I say the right word? And why did I talk lashon hara? And look how I spoke to my spouse or my parent or my child. But it was serious contemplation at the right time. That person is spurred on to change. That person gets up earlier the next morning because they want to fix it. So you can have two moods that look so close to one another. and the one is totally destructive, and the one is initiating growth and development. Sometimes we got to know ourselves. Am I being serious right now about life, or am I just falling into depression? If it's, God forbid, depression, we've got to work it out of our system completely. That is the most destructive, debilitating characteristic and mood that we can be in. If it's about serious contemplation, that can bring to good things. And likewise, he said, the difference between a person who is dancing a jig of abandonment, is drunk out of his mind in the pub, and he's having a good time, and he's jumping and dancing and laughing, can sometimes be a hair's breadth away from somebody who's in his element and greatest moment of joy, dancing on Simchas Torah. When you look at these two people on their faces, they're both dancing. They're both said l'chaim. They look like they're in the same frame of mind. They're worlds apart. The guy who's besimcha dancing with the Torah is just so enthused, he's excited, has a vigor and energy, a newfound motivation in life. He's filled with joy. Joy brings to great things in growth. And the other person is just, who cares? Eat, drink, and be merry, because tomorrow we might not be here anyway. So you might as well just enjoy life to the fullest. While it's happening, you might not know the difference, but you will know by what emerges from it. So very important in this whole thing is to know, why am I laughing? Is it a laugh of joy? Is it a laugh of disbelief? Is it a laugh of scorn and mocking? Because some people can laugh, and we've got to know ourselves well to know which category we fall into when it's unfolding. So what's interesting is that there was a difference in the circumcision between Abraham circumcising his son Yitzchok, who was circumcised at 8 days old. Yishmael, by contrast, was circumcised at 13 years old. So the Midrash says that Yishmael was actually causing a lot of harm to Yitzchok by saying to him, when they grew up, your bris milah was nothing. You had your circumcision when you were 8 days old. You didn't even know that it was happening. And mine I did when I was 13 years old. I knew exactly, entered into a space of mind. I had true self-sacrifice when I did the act of circumcision. And the question is, why did God say that a Jew circumcises at 8 days old? Shouldn't we wait to a point that we could understand the process and be cognizant of what's taking place in this covenant with Hashem? And Chassidus explains so beautifully that yes, we do want a journey of understanding, a journey of developing depth in the relationship. All of that has to happen. But the covenant with God transcends our reason. The covenant with Hashem is not limited to my understanding. It's not limited to my degree of feeling and sensitivity. And the reason why it was done at 8 days old was to tell us that we are connected to God in a way that transcends all of our reason, all of our rationale, all of our accomplished thinking processes, all the growth that's going to happen. We'll always know the day I was circumcised, it wasn't when I came to understand. The day I was circumcised was when I didn't even know what was going on. That is the depth of the relationship with Hashem, that it's not based on what I understand. It's an essential connection. And that is represented by the fact that we circumcised at 8 days old. We then have to grow. Then we have to learn and develop, and there are many sacrifices and commitments that we make through life. But the core, the root sacrifice, was something that transcended us. It was not born out of my understanding. It was born out of God's connection to us. And we'll end with this point as a final point, because we're running out of time, that we also have a contrast. We keep seeing the contrasts of this week's portion. It says that Avraham, when he was told to go and sacrifice his son on a distant mountain, Avraham saddled his donkey himself. Let's just go to the second point, because there's not much time for it. So the Gemara says that he rushed to do it himself. Avraham had servants. Avraham had people that could have assisted and helped him. He didn't have to rush early in the morning to go and do the saddling of his donkey all on his own. But why did he do it? Because when he had a mission to fulfill, he rushed to do it. He embraced it. He was passionate about it. He said, sure, I can get people to help and do it on my behalf. I want to do it. I want to be involved. I love this moment of communication with Hashem. And after all, he was about to go and sacrifice his own son. And nevertheless, he was rushing to do it. And the contrast is that only one other time do we see that a great person saddled his donkey, and I mentioned his name before, Bilam, who's contrasted with Avraham again and again. When he went to curse the Jewish people, it says that he got up early and he saddled his own donkey. And we learn from here in Ethics of Our Fathers that both love and hate go against the grain of how we would behave as people. Normally we have servants, we can organize, we can put in our diary, we've got a time and place, everything is being coordinated appropriately. But when we love deeply, we do acts of passion that transcend the norm. And the same thing happens, lahavdil, when there's great hate, when there's emotion of hatred. We behave in ways that undo logic, that go against what is our beneficial to us. We do things that are mad. We go against the norm in a negative way. And we both, again, given this contrast of both the chesed of Avraham and the evil of Bilam, the love of Avraham that brings him to transcend the norm of behavior. He rushes early morning to saddle his own donkey, and the hate of Bilam that brings him to do the same. The contrast is obviously so clear. We have to be beyond the norm in love rather than losing normalcy in hate. So this week we learned about so many messages of kindness, of chesed of Abraham, the journey of Abraham, and so many contrasts, societies, people, elements of life that are the very opposite, because we learn best when we contrast the society of Abraham with the society of Sedom, the Bilam, lahavdil, and the Avraham Avinu, the Lots of this world, and the Abrahams of this world, the laughter of mocking and the laughter of joy. If we can see the stark contrast between different realities, then we are on the path to building better futures for ourselves. Have a beautiful week. Thank you for listening. It's not easy to interrupt the shir when you're muted, but thank you for joining us and being part of us. Good night and God bless.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you so much.
Very nice.
Thank you.
Good Shabbos.
Thank
you.
You too. God bless.
Thank you, Rabbi.